I'm going to be reading from the Gospel according to St. Matthew, chapter 14. We're also in chapter 14 in Bible studies. That's pretty convenient for me. I'm going to start at verse 13. It'll also be on the screen. It starts off with Jesus. You see, it says, "Now when Jesus heard this." So what is it that Jesus heard? In this chapter, it begins with the death of John the Baptist, his cousin. Okay? His cousin, John the Baptist. Now, when Jesus heard about that, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them. And he cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to the disciples, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." The disciples replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowd. And all ate and were filled. And they even took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Amen. Amen. I want to get back to the Genesis reading that Brian shared with us today. I've always found Jacob's wrestling at the old Jabbok Ford a sad story, not just because of Jacob having that limp from there on. We'll get back to that after a little bit. But I think it's important to know what led up to this point. What's he doing wrestling? All by himself on one side of the creek. Everything else he loves is on the other. Where's he headed and why? I think that's kind of important. Because we didn't read that. That's not part of our reading. So let me tell you about it before we go over this wrestling match. I like wrestling, by the way. I like to say wrestling. If you recall, Jacob had run away from home. All right, not like his parents didn't encourage him. His mom, Rachel, said, "You need to get good." And his dad said, "You better run, son. Your brother Esau is fighting mad." Jacob liked to hang out around the tents, all right? Whereas his brother Esau was a hunter. And guess who he was hunting? He wanted himself some Jacob, all right? He wanted himself some Jacob because Jacob had tricked him into giving up his blessing as the firstborn son. And that meant a lot. That meant a lot. Esau come in hungry from an unsuccessful hunt. Jacob had traded him, it was no more than vegetable soup bowl for his blessing. Being tricked didn't sit rightly with Esau. He didn't take it well, to say the least. So Jacob hightailed it out of there. Now our Bible, that's not the Bible translation, all right? That's my translation. Jacob headed off to his cousins, all right, in the swinging town of, get this town name, Padam Aram. That's pretty good, if you like double letters everywhere. Padam Aram. So he hung out there. And Jacob did well. He did real good. God blessed him while he was there. And now Jacob's heading back home. All right? But he's not heading back by himself. He's bringing along with him all his wives and his concubines. They have big groups. All right? Plus all his kids, all his livestock, all right? All of his valuables. He's got all his wealth with him. And he had a lot. Between people, animals, and gold and goods, he had more than you could shake a stick at. And I could shake a pretty good stick. I think that's at least what Jacob hoped, was that it'd be impressive, you know? It'd be impressive. Because the last time he saw his brother in his rearview mirror, they didn't have cars back then. I get it. His brother was shaking a pretty mean stick himself. All right? So he's coming back. He's coming back home to show that he's a bigger man. Possibly a bigger man than he actually was. He's coming back to show him that he's done well and God has richly blessed him. And if God is blessing him, maybe his brother Esau could bless him too. But our passage starts out with the three words, the same night. The same night. It was that same day that Jacob helped all his wives, his concubines, his children across this river. All of his livestock, he makes sure his servants are all sent across with it. All of these goods were taken across. And he knew what he was going to do with that. The next day, he was going to send them in rows. He was going to send the goods and the servants and the livestock off first to ease his brother, to calm him down. Here's a gift. Take it if you want it. To soften it up a little bit more, he said, my wives and concubines, send them ahead. Take them if you want them. My kids. Everything that Jacob loved, he sent on ahead. Hoping it all soften up, because who was going to be the last one to cross that creek? Jacob. Didn't know if he wanted to go. So what essentially he was sending was a bribe for Esau. He was sending ahead a gift so overwhelming that no one could stay mad at the giver. Again, that's what Jacob hoped, at least. So Jacob sends off the bribe, or what our Bible calls the gift. And then, everyone else goes, and he's just sitting there contemplating what's about to happen. You ever have one of those nights you're really worried, you're thinking about something so big the next day that you can't sleep? That's the kind of night it was. But he decides to lay down. What's he used for a pillow? Anyone remember? You got to say it louder than that, Karen. A rock. Yeah, that's one of my favorite pillows. That's how that one guy made all his money. The My Pillow guy made all his money. He started with a rock, and no one was buying it, so he moved off to comfortable pillows. That's not a true story. So he's laying there on his rock, and a man, the story says, comes up and starts wrestling with him. Just starts wrestling with him. I've always wondered, who is this man? It doesn't really say, at least it's not clear exactly who it is that's wrestling Jacob. And so we look at the words of this mysterious man that renames Jacob. Jacob, if you recall, means the heel, because he came out, he was a twin, he came out holding on to his brother's heel. But Israel is what Jacob's renamed, and that's God wrestler. So that kind of gives you a clue who it might be. And this person, Jacob wrestles with, this representative of God, maybe even an angel, all right? The story calls a man. And the man says, you've striven with God, and we were reading the message there is what Brian was reading, because I just like the way it smoothly tells the story. But in our New Revised Standard, in the New King James Version, it says, you have striven with God and humans and have prevailed. You've been through some stuff with other folks and even with God, and you've worked it out. But this part where it says, and with humans. So I always wonder, what if it wasn't God at all? What if it wasn't a representative? But what if it was representing God, and the fact that it was someone Jacob knew? It was representing God in someone Jacob knew. at least Jacob saw God's face in this person. And that maybe that's why he needed to get away from some, so he wouldn't have to face that person again, because he had mixed him up. This person came and wrestled with him, and when they parted, after Jacob was blessed, he saw God's face in that person, so much so that he didn't want to see the face again. It was hard on him. Someone he struggled with blessed him. And it was just hard to be in that situation anymore. So Jacob takes off the next morning. So I've often wondered if it was Esau. You say, holy cow, Pastor, what are you talking about? What if God sent Esau as his representative and let Esau bring a blessing to his brother? Crazy theology. I know you could say that. Pastor, you're off your rocker again. But if we read on, we see that Esau is in a much better place than Jacob is whenever they come together for their meeting. Esau is a different person to him, at least in terms of spirit and inner peace. But I just say that I don't mean to contradict centuries of biblical interpretation or your own beliefs. That's just something I was thinking. So let me change the subject. Do you mind if I tell you a story? Anyone besides Mark, mind if I get to know Jerry? Put your hands down. Thank you, Gary, for not raising yours. So I remember the moment and the ride back after I got picked up from my first experience as a camp counselor at Camp Adventure for middle-aged children, the United Methodist Church camp for middle school-aged children that's located at Lake Webster up north here in Indiana. I had just retired from the Marine Corps. 20 years I'd been in the Marine Corps. 20 years, 13 days, the week before. Had just driven all the way back from Camp Lejeune, got home, was off to camp again. I was 38 years old. My daughter had told me that she wouldn't go to camp unless I was one of the counselors. Okay? I will tell you, the whole time we were at camp, she never once said a word to me until we're on our way home that she just couldn't shut up. But, so I had her sit up and talk to her mom. Yeah, because I was embarrassing. Can you imagine that? 38-year-old man at camp as a counselor. Camp was 6 days long. They dropped us off Sunday afternoon, and I was picked up Friday night. Okay? 6 days. Holy cow. I was assigned a group of 12 6th through 8th grade age boys. 12 of them. And we shared a cabin. I was the oldest counselor there. The camp director was 26 years old. I'm 38. I'm out there in one of the little cabins with the kids, no air conditioning. What? I was paired up with the youngest camp counselor, a boy of 16 who had 8 kids himself to watch over. And we shared this cabin. The first night, terrible thunder, lightning storm. Lightning strikes a tree right beside our cabin. Tree limb falls across our cabin. Boys scream. One kid throws up in his sleeping bag out of fear. Thank goodness he was one of the 8, so I didn't have to clean it up. True story. The entire ride home from this camp experience can simply be stated in 2 words. I slept. I came back on a spiritual high, but I was physically worn out. I was blessed, but exhausted. And my blessings came to me through the means of my many new friends. The counselors who also were there, the directors, and my new brothers and sisters in faith that I met. But they cost me something. They cost me something. I'd already been hired to work another job, and the first thing I told them was I need a week off. go to camp. They said, okay. So it cost me a week's vacation. Can you guess how many days a person that's just hired at a job and done 0 days of work gets a year? 1 week, you're right. It cost me my vacation that year. It also cost me energy and effort. Now, I'm not talking, whenever I say what it cost, I'm not talking about a transaction that I paid for the blessing. That's not how it works. I'm not talking about buying blessings. You can't buy a blessing. I'll tell you, that's the truth. I'm talking about the reality that blessings don't normally come to us when we're reclining at ease, when we're doing nothing. They don't normally happen. Instead, we sense blessings when we expend ourselves, when we pour ourselves out in service, when we engage in some effort. And yes, sometimes it feels like wrestling. Wrestling with the very ones we're trying to serve, the very ones who will be a blessing to us if we just keep at it. Keep at it like Jacob did. And we refuse to let go of them until we've helped them. Sometimes that hurts. There's heartbreak when we're wrestling with some folks. But there's a blessing. Despite the pain, despite the struggle, despite the sapping of energy, we hold on through the struggle for the blessing. And it will come. It will come. That's part of the promise and the hope. That's part of the joy and the peace. Oddly enough, there doesn't seem to be any wrestling written into the gospel according to Matthew in our reading about the feeding of the 5,000. There's no wrestling there, you think. You think there isn't. Of course, I always thought it was odd that we call it the feeding of the 5,000. Text clearly says that there were 5,000 men besides women and children. Matthew. Typical guy. But I bet it would be hard to count the total people that were there anyway. The math would be beyond me, that's for sure. I always wondered, did most of the men come alone? Maybe there were only a few women and children, so they didn't want to count them. Or was the crowd actually more like this today? More women than men and children, that kind of thing. Maybe men were the minority. In which case, we could just call this the feeding of the 15,000. Well, that'll make me feel better, so we're going to do that sometimes this morning. Purely speculation, I suppose, but at least we could call it 5,000 plus. Let's just call it 5,000 plus. Just to acknowledge that there were others there. And I got to tell you, and this may sound like I'm deviating, but I get conflicted. This is something I wrestle with. You say, gosh, this is a simple thing. Well, it's always the simple things you wrestle with, right? Does this count so hard to provide? It's just an example. What we're wrestling with in trying to say 15,000 instead of 5,000, what we're wrestling with here is our presuppositions and our prejudices. Could have been more. Anytime we try to change, when we come up in conflict, we're trying to change who we are to be more Christ-like, it's a struggle. We wrestle with it. We wrestle with it. It's never an easy exercise to live like Christ. Perhaps a more important wrestling happening in this story is the disciples wrestling with responsibility. The disciples then represent us, the disciples today, wrestling with responsibility. They say, send them away so they can take care of their own hunger. We're out here in the middle of the country. We're out here in the middle of the country. It's getting late. It'll be dark in an hour. Jesus, tell these people to go so they can walk 15 miles either back home or to the next village, bang on a door in the middle of the night and beg for food. So we barely got enough to feed feed ourselves. And that's if we break it down. Someone's getting a fish head. Someone's getting a fish head tonight. That's all I got to say. Now, you and I, if we were in the same situation, we'd think that's a good idea. We got to send them away so they can get fed. All right, we can't leave these people starving to death out here. There's nothing out here. We think that's the right solution. We think it's the right solution if we gave them space to deal with their situation themselves, because they have freedom of choice. Let's give them this themselves. It works in our culture today. We're going to honor their freedom by letting them go and make their own decision. Jesus has a different response, friends. Jesus has a different response. You might even say that he tells his disciples not to let go of the hungry ones until they have been blessed by them. Maybe that's assuming too much. I don't think so. Maybe it should be that the hungry ones shouldn't let go until they get the blessing that they want and need. That's one of those both or same kind of situations. Where is the blessing? How is the blessing shared? That's one of those abiding questions before us as disciples of Jesus Christ. Maybe the better question will be, will it cost us to help others? In this same discussion at another feeding, the disciples say, hey, we ain't got it. We could spend, if we all went and worked for a year, we couldn't have enough money to feed these people. You and I might say, if I max out both my credit cards, they wouldn't have enough food at the McDonald's, the Taco Bell, Papa Pepperoni's, the Mexican place over here, El Grande Poblano in Chesterfield. They won't have enough food in those towns to feed 15,000 folk. And we couldn't afford it. Judy, our church budget got enough money in it to feed that many people? I'm talking a big platter at Taco Bell. I'm talking, the Nacho Bel Grande. $5, you must have gone to a different one. I'm talking this year, all right? Not 1982. Come on now. Will it cost us? I got to tell you, friends, it's clear to see that helping others will cost us. It's going to cost us. You hear me? And that's what the disciples fear. Maybe that's what we fear too. We don't have enough. We couldn't possibly meet this need. Jesus asked them and us to think again. I mean, we may limp before we finish wrestling with this problem, but doggone it, maybe the blessing is woven into that limping too. Or maybe the limping becomes a sign of the blessing. Here's all I got to say about it. We can't help but hear the story of the feeding of the 5,000 or 15,000 from Matthew and the wrestling story from Genesis. Like Jacob, who believed he saw the face of God in his struggle, we are reminded that in meeting the needs of the hungry before us, we're also seeing the face of God ourselves. As we do it to those who some consider the least of these, the overlooked, the lost, the lonely, as we do it to them, the ones who can't possibly pay us back, the ones who can't possibly say thank you to each of us personally, the ones who haven't earned their bread and fish but just receive it and surprisingly share it, as we do it to them, it's like we're doing it to Jesus. He said that. So the one that we're helping is the one that's right there before us, who will bless us because we will see Christ's face as we help them. Our calling today, my brothers and sisters, is to roll up our sleeves because, friends, when we begin calling ourselves Christians, the wrestling begins. Thanks be to God.